Welcome to another episode of Facts. I am your host, Stephen Boyce. I'm doing an episode on an early church writer that we don't have hardly any writings of. More importantly, he's a church leader that I think we need to spend some time learning about, because one of the things that I want to do all the time on this program is to advance our understanding of things that we may be alienated from or know very, very little about. And one of the saints I want to talk about today is an early Christian who was probably a follower of Peter and Paul, not just a follower, but after their deaths became a leader in the church that they started in Rome and advanced the gospel in the city of Rome by appointing more leaders, bringing more people to the Christian faith. And what little bit we may have of fragmented statements or teachings, that's what I want to cover today under the name of Saint Linus of Tuscany, Saint Linus of Rome. He is one of the individuals that we're going to look at as we continue to advance our knowledge of the fathers. He's an important one, but very, very little is known about him. We're going to talk about, did he teach anything to the church? What contributing factors played into his role as a bishop in Rome? Relics, do we know where he is? Do we know where his dead body is? Do we know anything about him? What did the other church fathers say about it? And I think this is a key point to keep in mind, is when we go through these types of teachings and we look at the different men and women of faith who came before us, sometimes we see names in the Holy Scriptures that are just kind of dropped in an epistle, whether it's Paul or Peter's epistle, whoever's writings we look at, or even going through historical accounts like Acts. People are just mentioned and we quickly go through them and say, I mean, we'll never know who that is. But some of these names leave for us a legacy that other traditions pick up. Now, even if these traditions are embellished or a little bit advanced or something that's considered a little bit over the top, we should still consider them, because typically there's elements of truth, even in exaggerated things. Now, there are some things about Linus that I don't think are really exaggerated. In fact, they can be corroborated by testimony of other church fathers, especially in the region of Rome. There are some disputes about relics or writings about this gentleman, our saint today, St. Linus. But as it relates to his involvement in the church, there really isn't any dispute about that. And so I want to consider him. I want to take him into consideration as we examine him. In the thumbnail I brought on the screen here, we could perceive that these three individuals were a part of the work that were going on at Rome. And you know, there's so much to say about these things. We believe that in this picture here, he is the one in the middle, as you see him. Petrobulus is probably on the left. Hermas is the second to left. What's interesting about Hermas here is this is possibly the same who's attributed to the writing called the Shepherd, or the Shepherd of Hermas. I did an entire episode on that a few months back. If you would like to go back and listen to that, feel free to do so. It seems like what we have here in the middle is our friend, our saint for the day, St. Linus, who is holding a text in his hand. To the right of him is potentially Caius and Philologus on the far right. Now, these are individuals that could be considered a part of the 70. This is one of the debates that goes on and on and on about, we go to Luke's gospel, we find that there's these 70 disciples that were Jesus that were sent out two by two. The other gospels display it as 12. And there are 12 major apostles. But there were other eyewitnesses. And Luke wants us to focus on these other individuals, mainly because some of them are probably a part of his collection of the testimonies. We find this in Luke's gospel. We find this in Acts. We see that there's other individuals that are on the scene, like the two disciples on the road of Emmaus, for example, that are not listed as the 12, but they probably were part of that 70. There are some manuscripts that say there's 72, so there's even some debate about 70 or 72. And then if you go to Acts, we know there were other witnesses that were with Jesus from the time of his baptism to his death and resurrection, because Peter called for a replacement of Judas in Acts chapter 1. And what do we find there? We find Justus, we find Matthias. There's two of the names right there, in addition to the other two that were with Jesus on the road of Emmaus. So Luke wants us to know there were others. So the tradition has it that we see the five gentlemen in the picture that we're looking at here. They were a part of that original group. They were a part of that 70. And one of them is St. Linus. Now, we know very, very little about him. But what we do have of him, I think, is worth at least celebrating and spending time talking about. Now, in the second letter to Timothy, Paul is concluding what would be his last will and testament, these last words that he has before he is taken from the earth. In fact, we know from the writing of 2 Timothy, the feel of death is creeping at his door. He states as much. He realizes he's reached the end of his journey. But with that comes preparation, because you have to work to make sure things are in order. And one of the things that we find in chapter 4 is that Paul is making sure things are in order. He's giving instruction to Timothy. He's talking about Luke being with him. He's asking Timothy to send St. Mark to him. He's talking about individuals who he has left at different places sick, or people that needed to be cared for. He mentions people that abandoned him and kind of left him high and dry in the middle of his chaos. He mentions people by name. He mentions Aquila and Priscilla, who are very important to Paul's ministry in other epistles as well. We find them even in the book of Acts being a major portion of helping aid the advancement of the gospel and even equipping some of God's greatest leaders in the church. These are important figures to Paul, and he's making sure everything's in order. Then he also mentions to greet the household of Onesiphorus, who he mentions as a potential convert to the faith. He mentions Erastus, and he talks about how he remained behind in Corinth. Trophimus, he had to leave in Miletus sick. And then he comes to this, to come to him before winter. So come see me before winter time. Now, that could be because of weather conditions. It could be because of a scheduled execution. There's a lot of dispute about that. But then he mentions this greeting to Eubulus, that he greets Timothy. And then he mentions these other figures that become important. He mentions Pudens, Linus, and Claudia, and all other brethren. So these individuals are with Paul, greeting and saying their salutations. Now, there's two names that I want to focus on particularly here. The one in the middle, Linus, that's the one that's going to be attributed to an important figure for us. And the other one is Claudia, who is a female. She's a woman. If you look at her name, even in the Greek text, it is in the feminine. These are going to become important people that connect to our person, St. Linus, who was mentioned by Paul there. So there are hints. Where is he involved? Is he a part of the ministry of Peter? Is he a part of the ministry of John? Who's he a part of? Well, we don't see him ever connected to John, but we do see him connected to Peter and Paul. And it seems like this is understood not just in Rome, but even by Eastern church fathers and those that are influenced even in parts of North Africa like Tertullian and others. You're going to see a continual demonstration that St. Linus was known as a leader in Rome. So he's mentioned here by Paul. He's mentioned in the second letter while Paul's about to die. Now, remember, Peter and Paul seem to be imprisoned at the same time. Both were probably executed within a year or so of each other from what we can tell. Now, Paul included interesting comments here about Linus, because if Paul dies around the year 67 to 68, there's some dispute about when that might be. He's anticipating surviving at least to the winter. So it could be the turn of a year. Again, that could be the time of just come here before the weather problems or an execution is at hand. And if it's around the time of the winter, we're about to flip another year. It could be that he wants Timothy to have these things done, to travel himself, to say his farewells. That would place that 67, 68 AD timeline. Now, St. Linus is told to have been ordained by Peter and Paul, and specifically by Paul, to remain in Rome and continue the apostolic ministry through succession. And that timeline would work because what we learn is that he was a bishop for about 12 years. So he was there from the time of Paul's death immediately after. That would take us between 79 and 80 AD. And that would make perfect sense with the timeline that we're going to receive from others. It's been written that Linus, who was a friend of Paul and Peter, became the church's second bishop to continue on the ministry of his two mentors. And that's what ends up happening. It's believed he served from approximately, like I said, anywhere from 67 and 68 over to about 79 or 80. Now, tradition tells us that he was martyred around that year, 79, 80 on September 23rd. Now, we have an exact idea of his memorial because the church still celebrates that day of his death and martyrdom. Now, we have no record of his martyrdom or how he died. It is simply somebody's idea and theory that we continue to live into, but he is listed a part of martyrdoms. We don't know how, we don't know the exact timing and even where for that matter. We'd assume it was in Rome, but the feast day of his martyrdom has always been, as long as anybody can remember in record, September 23rd, and to this day it is still celebrated as such. It is stated that he was actually buried next to St. Peter. Now, when they found the tomb of St. Peter in the Vatican, when they found the relics, there were also names next to it. Now, there is an inscription right next to where Peter was buried that has Linus there in Greek letters. The argument is that was not the whole name, that was the last half of a name. Here's something to consider as well. A, that could be true. It might not be. We do have record they were buried together, so we should expect to find inscriptions somewhere in the proximity of each other. But it could be somebody else. There is another possibility here too. Linus himself may have been called Linus, but his name is shortened in Linus. It could be a longer name, and Linus is short for something longer. And so the inscription could be him with his fuller name. By the way, that is not unusual. You can go through the New Testament, and we see this kind of idea on a regular basis. For example, when you look at individuals like Silas, there's times where you read Silas's name as Silvanus or Silas. We find this typical in many of the names inscribed in the New Testament, where we find a partial name or a different spelling. So it could be that was the case in the inscription. So A, it might not be Linus at all, or B, it is Linus and it's not shortened, or C, it is Linus whose name was actually longer and they put his full name on there rather than the shortened name. There's a lot of possibilities here. I have no reason to excuse it, but his celebration is there, and it is believed that the relics of St. Linus were in the Vatican right next to St. Peter, which would make perfect sense. Now, a really cool fact, I've actually been in the presence of a relic of St. Linus right here in Greenville at Prince of Peace. There is under the altar there different, which is tradition in most Catholic churches, there is a relic or relics of individuals that are usually placed under the altar, representing a similar thing that we find, one, in history and two, in scripture. The idea of the souls under the altar in the book of Revelation 1, 2. When Christianity was illegal, they went into these tombs where saints were buried and offered Eucharist on top of those and used those almost as a table, as an altar, to distribute the Eucharist to people, kind of in underground church and hiding. And so this kind of maintained its tradition throughout the church as a result of these two things, the usage and the idea of imagery that we find in Revelation, and also the historic practice that was done very, very early on in Rome. So if you go to Prince of Peace, they actually have certified documents from the Vatican that what they have in the church right there under the altar is one of the relics of St. Linus. And so, I mean, that's pretty cool if that all works out and is validated as stated. But it's here that he's buried to St. Peter, and that is where the tradition comes from. And we have some discovery to even believe something like this is true. Now, it is believed that also St. Linus is one of the first to push in the time of Eucharistic prayer for women to wear veils. Now, there's some arguments as to whether or not that is true. Some would say this is a later tradition, but at the same time, I would actually argue that it's a tradition that might have been maintained later, because we do see this constant push of women veiling during the time of Eucharist and then during the time of prayer in these churches. One, it's culturally common. It's culturally common. Paul talks about this even in 1 Corinthians. Some would say that statement attributed to Linus was just simply taken from Paul, Well, I would think so. If he was trained by Paul and he spent time with Paul, I would imagine that he would teach Pauline sermons and theology. So he was pretty big on pushing the idea that St. Linus would be the one who continues this tradition, perhaps, that women showed reverence in church. Now, there's a lot of debate about the head coverings and whether that's hair or an actual veil and so forth. That's not the point of the debate here. Maybe that could be another episode one day. But the point of it here is that he is the one little bit of fragmented writing or teaching we have of St. Linus is attributed to women covering their head in Eucharistic prayer and worship, which is a sign of reverence and holiness, not a sign of like bondage or something like that, as we have taken it in modern culture and the way we have taken it in modern day thinking. Very different at that time, very, very different in the first century. But he is certainly a part of that. When he is mentioned, he is also known for pushing forward more bishops in the city of Rome. As the apostles were martyred, we see the church grow. And this is what Tertullian meant when he wrote that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. As the apostles were killed, and this is what he was explaining in that section of his writings, of his apologetics, is that the more you kill us, the more we grow. And so when Peter and Paul were killed, they left their successors in place. And we see Paul doing that. He's putting things in order, as I mentioned earlier. Linus would be one of those people that is setting things in order. And as he's distributing these out, it appears that he named 15 bishops to be in charge of the different churches in Rome, where he was overseeing the operations of these different parishes and sees within the realm of the Roman Church as it advanced and grew. Now, it's interesting to bring that up because, as I mentioned in the last couple of episodes, we've talked about, was there a bishop in Rome before the East or at the same time as the East? And that was partially due to the fact that Dr. James White had made some sort of statement recently that, well, you know, it looks like the tradition of bishopric started in the East and it moved west. I did a whole episode on that. If you miss it, it's in the most recent episodes. Please go back and check that out. It's the second to last, I believe. And I demonstrated why that is completely erroneous. There is no validity to that. Even in Ignatius's letters, I disproved it. But we have early traditions that the bishopric had already started before the writings of Ignatius around the early 100s or to the mid 100s. Here's an example. We have multiple attestation from others that he was the bishop of Rome, that he was a part of the succession of St. Peter and Paul, and he was left behind to oversee and continue the ministry of the apostles. And part of doing that was what was instructed to Timothy. What you've learned from us, commit to faithful men. Lay your hands not so quickly on just anybody, but actually make sure they are valid for the ministry. Paul is instructing that. And we already see that happening in St. Linus's ministry. We see 15 early bishops sent out. Now, another name that was mentioned here that I find interesting was Claudia in 2 Timothy chapter 4. Claudia is perceived as to being the mother of St. Linus. Now, it doesn't say that in 2 Timothy 4, but tradition tells us that was the name of his mother. And so perhaps Linus and Claudia being there was son and mother. It's also attributed to the fact that Claudia is connected to the first name that we saw there, but we don't know either. Pudens. So Pudens could be husband, wife, and Linus is in the middle. There's a lot of dispute based on inscriptions with these names, particularly Claudia being attributed to bringing the gospel and being a part of the work goes further into Britain, into England. And so her name is found in inscriptions there. Could be the possibility, but it was a very common name too. So there could have been many that were sent that direction. We don't know. But here we find another person of interest connected to St. Linus as potentially his mother. We don't know for sure. Another thing that should be noted about St. Linus is his name is still used today in one of the earliest Eucharistic prayers. If you were to go to a Catholic Mass, or even some of the Anglo-Catholic Masses, depending on who they are and what they're following, you can find these prayers to the saints, because when you go into the prayer of the Eucharist, it does a section here where it says, your blessed apostles and martyrs, Peter, Paul, Andrew, James, John, Thomas, James, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Simon, Jude, Linus, Anacletus, Clement, Sixtus, Cornelius, Cyprian, etc. Linus is mentioned in the lineup directly in relation to after the apostles. And then it is Anacletus and Clement, which is the order that we see from Irenaeus and others of the bishopric in Rome. You have Peter, Paul, Linus, Anacletus, and then you find Clement of Rome, who is attributed to writing the first letter that we call First Clement. That seems to be the consistent order. It's even in the Eucharistic prayer that we find in the early church. So as I stated, he's there for about 12 years. He's connected to the ministry of St. Paul. He is possibly listed by St. Paul, certainly would have been connected to Peter as well. Irenaeus wrote of him. Irenaeus talks about his order, like I said, that he shows he is directly after. Irenaeus had this to say around the year 180. The blessed apostles then, having founded and built up the church, committed it into the hands of Linus, the office of Bishopric, the Episcopate. So according to the earliest succession list, the Bishop of Rome, passed down from Irenaeus and others, and even Eusebius comes into play here and attests that this is the order. Eusebius, later in the 4th century, comes behind, affirms this as well. All agree Linus was entrusted with the office of Peter and Paul in Rome, continued this ministry, and produced 15 additional bishops to work in the city of Rome, which demolishes this idea that this arose in the East or something like that. Now, Jerome describes Linus in these words: first, after Peter, to be in charge of the Roman church. Now, remember, Jerome is in Rome. He has unlimited access to things that he needs in order to put together any kind of writing, any kind of ideas. He's got access to whatever he thinks. He believes that Linus is directly after Peter, and Eusebius goes on to quote it this way: the first to receive the episcopate of the Church of Rome after the martyrdom of Peter and Paul. Now, John Chrysostom, again in the East, recognized this. So the idea that the bishopric Dr. White instituted not long ago, that it came from the East to the West, maybe read the Eastern Fathers, because that's not their perspective. Their perspective is that the bishopric started in all of the apostolic churches, including the West. Here's an Eastern Father, John Chrysostom, said that Linus, some say, was second bishop of the Church of Rome after Peter, while the Liberian Catalogue describes Peter as the first bishop of Rome and Linus as his successor in the same exact office. So you see that again, right after Peter. How it's worded is debated. Was Peter the first or was Linus the first? To me, the terminology is not worth getting overly confused by. I think what we demonstrate is that some of these records will look at as apostolic and successors. The apostle himself and the successors. If you want to put the apostle in that same list, you're not doing harm because you're finding the same exact list and you're finding the successors rightly behind them. And those things are being corroborated and shown to be accurate just by multiple attestation. So the chronology of the early popes, again, it gets disputed. It gets argued against. Eusebius and Jerome date Linus's episcopate between 68 to 80. Like I said, there's room for a year or two in here. I don't like getting hung up on the exact number day. There's so much that we don't know, but we can give ourselves a time frame that makes sense. To get into the nitpickiness of a year or two, I don't think it's worth stressing over. We talked about this with Ignatius, and I'm currently writing a scholarly document on Ignatius. And this is one of the things that I came up with even writing the scholarly work. How many people get uptight about the year 107 and the year 117? Or it's like, wow, the statements about them are true. They didn't give us a, day, month, and year. In most cases of the historic church, we have time frames. We might even get a month, but not a year. We might get an event that helps us give a year. And then even then, there's reasons to argue how often did that event happen or things like that. Let's not lose sight of the timeline here and have to worry so much, because some would say he was around even earlier than that. And it could be that he was doing the work of bishopric while Peter and Paul were still alive, they were focusing on the authoritative side of writing and distributing to the churches as a whole. And he was doing the work of bishopric in just Rome. So there's even ways to consider, well, some say he's even earlier, like he's not just after the death, he's being called one during the life of the apostles themselves, because he may have been doing that work, and that work was seen as bishopric work, while Peter and Paul are looking at the churches as a whole. So that could be a part of the disputes, that could be a part of the arguments. I don't think it's worth getting ourselves all worked up over. Linus, as I demonstrated in the picture earlier, and he is seen as holding a book. He's seen as holding these letters. It would be interesting to note that perhaps he was seen as being a guardian of the writings of the apostles, with also building on that in his own teachings. There's a lot to be said about that. But according to the document I mentioned earlier, Linus was an Italian born in the area of Tuscany. His father's name was recorded as Herculanus. The Apostolic Constitutions mention, as I stated, his mother was possibly this Claudia lady mentioned at the end of 2 Timothy chapter number 4. So after this, we see these names. The Bible doesn't say anything else about Linus. There's nothing about Claudia. We're just left to kind of guess. So Linus has decreed that women should cover their heads in church, instituted 15 bishops in the city of Rome, and then apparently died a martyr on September 23rd. That's where we've come up to this point. That's where we are with all this. So let's talk about his legacy, and then we'll wrap this part up about him. There's a tomb that was discovered in St. Peter's Basilica in 1615, as I mentioned earlier, which was inscribed with the letters Linus. However, a note by Torrigio records that there were merely the final 5 letters of some unknown longer name. But as I stated, what if Linus was short for those names all along? We don't know. A letter on the martyrdom of Peter and Paul was attributed to Linus, so some have ascribed him to write the story about the martyrdom of Peter and Paul. We don't know. We don't know. Could be involved, could be completely detached. He certainly would have skin in the game. It would certainly be important to him to have some sort of involvement in teaching their legacy, given they were his mentors and he trained them. Or it just could have been oral tradition that was carried on that Linus continued to teach. We don't know for sure. Again, there's uncertainty in a lot of these areas. Now, this other document asserts that Linus was buried on the Vatican Hill adjacent to Peter the Apostle, which is now known as the Vatican, in near St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican City. So there's reason even early on to assume he was buried somewhere near Peter. So I have no reason to doubt it. I have no reason to doubt we have his relics. To me, it makes perfect sense. The church has maintained a lot of the relics of the early apostles and their successors that are still found today. So this is St. Linus. St. Linus is an important figure. Not much is known about him, as you can tell. It's kind of like, wow, we have a lot of uncertainty about this guy. But what is not argued is his role in the city of Rome in the very, very early church. These unsung heroes, whether martyred or died of natural causes, were involved in distributing the gospel into Europe, specifically here in Rome. And it could be these other people attached to him did go to England, and that's why we see inscriptions to them. We stand on the shoulders of giants who have very small legacies saved for us in history. And I want to be careful. I want to be overly careful and cautious that we do not ignore their legacies. And so here's St. Linus of Rome. Here's St. Linus of Tuscany. Here's a man who was little known about, but did great things for the gospel that built on the work of the apostles that very few people can attest to or say they know anything about. And our goal today was to unveil some of this and introduce to you some early saints who don't get enough accolades. All right. Well, this is your first time listening to us and you enjoy these kinds of conversations and discussions. please make sure you like and subscribe if you're following on YouTube. If you're on one of our platforms for our different distributions every week on the podcast, make sure you follow us so that you get notifications every time a new episode shows up, and you can tune in and listen at your most convenient time, either driving or listening on your way to work or doing work or whatever the case may be. We appreciate the growth that has continually come into this program. We've seen new subscribers daily on every single platform that we use, and we know that there's a lot of good content being put out by others, so we appreciate you sacrificing your time to hear what we have to show and listen to our special guests and hear what's being said and taught in our church history. As always, folks, thanks for tuning into this episode. Grace and peace to you.